Eric is one of those people who doesn't need any introduction. He's been involved in research, computer science research at fine institutions like UC Berkeley, go Bears, at Bell Labs at Xerox PARC, but he's also been a leader in a number of businesses, including Sun Microsystems, which is where Eric and I first had the opportunity to work together on an initiative called Net Day, which was all about connecting schools to the internet at Novell, at Google, and now a new holding company called Alphabet. So why don't you start off by telling...
Well, by the way, I have to introduce you. So you guys probably don't know, but I'm here because this gentleman is a hero of mine. He has spent 20 years, and I know this because I physically know it, and I spent the time in the White House with him, trying to make technology policy for America and the world scale, get money for us, and invest in things that mattered. It is a great honor for me to be with you.
Thank you.
And so we're clear, he's still there. He's the #2 in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House.
Thank you. Thank you. So why don't you tell the audience a little bit about Alphabet, because I'm sure everyone has heard of Google.
I feel like I feel like it's like Sesame Street. You're in charge of letters. So we've announced G, of course, and we've also talked about Google Life Sciences, and we have some more coming. I think likely ones would include some of the ones that we've already announced. Calico is a business that's looking into essentially aging research and businesses. We already have a subsidiary called Nest, which is doing very well. And there's a lot of emphasis on our access business, which you know as Google Fiber. We're busy separating. It's typical of Google to announce this without actually having worked out all the details. And so that's what we're doing now. You'll see that over the next 6-9 months.
So why don't we start off with talking about some of the underlying technology trends? What do you think are the major technology trends that you're seeing, whether it's increases in global connectivity or advances in enabling technologies like deep learning? What do you see as the key drivers?
I think for this audience, because we're in San Francisco, I just like to presume the broad success of smartphones, fast networks, and cloud computing. Most people are still talking about that. We sort of assume that's all going to happen. The industry has now moved to that architecture, and it's going to be, years for the incumbents to move over, and the customers will move over. But we know that the world is better off when you're on a fast network, wired or wireless, a gigabit wired, and a LTE network getting faster. We know that people are now essentially living on smartphones and mobile devices of one kind or another, and we know that the old architectures are giving away to cloud computing, which is scalable computing. So let's just take that for granted. So the question is, what's next? In the last few years, something which I did not think was going to happen has begun to really happen. And it started with language recognition, voice recognition, and computer vision. And it is now the case that computers see better than humans. That is literally their visual resolution, their ability to accurately identify things that are in scenes and so forth is mechanically and in a measured way more accurate than humans, even when humans are perfectly awake and perfectly sober. Right? So that has a lot of implications for things like self-driving cars. So when I'm in a self-driving car, which I still find rather exciting, the fact that I'm sort of comforted by the fact that it sees better than I do, with or without my glasses on. And that means that over the next decade or so, as this technology broadly becomes available, you're going to see a lot of impacts of better sight. I'll give you another example, is radiologists. I would worry if I were a radiologist right now, simply because the visual image that is a radiologist's work is better done as a computer image by a computer doing diagnostics, right? Because they can just do it better. Mm-hmm. Now, with that and with this advances that we've gotten with speech, it's reasonable to expect that we really will be conversing with these devices and we'll be interacting with them because they have the ability to see in a mechanical sense. And then there's this huge debate in the industry of what happens after that, right? What we know is that things that are repetitive, especially low-level routine activities of humans, will be replaced by computer and automation. By low-level, I mean things which are repetitive, that don't require a lot of creativity or a lot of judgment. And by the way, we know this because this has been going on for my whole life. And in one form or another, it's been going on for almost 200 years. So it's likely to continue. There's a huge debate as to how far does it go, how high does it go, when does it get to the point where it feels that it's almost human-like and so forth. And my view of that is it's largely science fiction.
Right. And so how long do you think it'll take before a computer can read a college-level textbook and answer the questions at the back?
It depends on what subject. There are quite a few research projects which produce college-level papers which, when inserted with human-level papers, get reasonable-level grades, okay? Which is not the same thing as the best, or maybe the grading standards are uneven, or God knows. So it looks like we can do sort of normal quality, sort of average quality work of that kind. When people ask that question, they're usually actually asking a harder question, which is when can a computer do as well as the best human? When can a computer do better than a human? And again, there is not agreement on that for many, many reasons. And the underlying mechanics of machine learning, which is what I'm talking about, it works incredibly well when you have an immensely large amount of data and a strong measurement function. I'll give you an example of Google, Alphabet, whatever. You have a very clear measurement function, which is people are clicking on the ads, people are clicking on the links, so we can measure that. So that's amenable to that. I'll give you an example where I would love machine learning to provide great value, and I'll pick something horrific, terrorism, right? The good news is there's so few terrorist incidents that it's very difficult to sort of look at the universe of terrorist incidents and sort of come to an outcome.
It's too sparse.
It's just too sparse.
Yeah.
But let's take a look at, I'll give you another example, which I'm very excited about, is healthcare. It's crazy to me that these healthcare systems have these huge internal proprietary epoch-based EHRs, and you helped set this up, so great job. You got the data there, right? But what are we doing to analyze it? I want to be able to walk into the doctor and the doctor say, I know why you're here. Like, how do you know? I said, my computer told me you'd be coming in today because we predicted with your current declining health, you're going to need to see me today. Now, you sit there and you say, is that possible? It might be. But we're at the point now, think of it as pattern matching, right? Remember I said vision? What is vision? It's pattern matching. Well, let's say that generalizes to the healthcare record. So you kind of look at the patterns, you begin to see the patterns. I've since learned in talking to people in the medical profession that a lot of what they do at the analytical level is really pattern matching, looking for these. So there's hope for two things. One is much greater advice to doctors, which will clearly be very good from health, but also the discovery things which humans don't see, patterns that are across such a large cohort that our intuition isn't strong enough.
Right. So I think that, the continued advance of machine learning combined with these huge amounts of data, that seems like a pretty safe bet. But what are some things that you think are potential black swans or that are low probability but high consequence?
Well, I'll give you an example of, let's pick something like chemistry, okay? And I'm not a chemist, but roughly what happens in chemistry is there's huge empires of businesses that build new chemicals and materials and so forth in business, either for sort of lotions or mechanical things or fabrics or surfaces. Now, we have a good enough understanding of the way carbon works, essentially, that we can probably use the computers to help generate these compounds faster. So if you could accelerate that industry faster, right, how much is that worth to our economy? A lot, right? A lot of new products, a lot of new services. You and I were participants some years ago in a manufacturing task force at the White House where we were presented with this extraordinary array of new manufacturing surfaces, right? Much lighter materials and so forth. Again, if we can accelerate, that's an example. My favorite example is the following. Take the chemistry book and have a computer sort of read it.
Right.
Right. And imagine that the computer could actually assemble all of the formulas with enough work and actually produce something new.
Right.
Now that might lead to some serious accelerations. Now, I don't know what the probability of that is. We're nowhere near being capable to do that, but that would be a wonderful outcome.
Yeah. What do you think, what are some of the benefits of these emerging technologies that you're most excited about, not only in the United States, but in a developing country context?
Well, everything we're talking about, of course, this is the World Affairs Council, so thank you for having this. It needs to be put in context that the biggest achievement in the last 20 years has been the taking of people, roughly 2 billion people, from abject poverty to what they would consider to be middle class and what we would consider to be lower middle class. Literally going from worried about hunger, worried about education, worried about personal safety, to the point where they have a moderately acceptable life from our perspective. Right? That achievement, which is an achievement of globalization and connectivity and trade and so forth, is not to be sneezed at. Right? And the economic growth, and much of the economic growth in the world over the next couple decades, will be coming from those people as they move up into what we consider to be solid middle class. Right? So I'm very excited about that. And a lot of that has it's now clear occurred because of the prevalence of connectivity networks and smartphones. And I think there's evidence that we're going to get another 2 to 3 billion people who today are not connected will be connected to the internet through newer generations of even more powerful and even less expensive smartphones. And that will change their lives in innumerable ways.
What role are companies like Google and Facebook playing in extending connectivity in developing countries?
Well, the first and foremost thing that we're doing is the Android operating system is by far the #1 operating system that everybody's going to be using there, and the low-cost phones will almost all be using Android. And of course, Android has the benefit of being free to such people, so we start with the correct price. The issue with connectivity is largely one that the provider charges are much higher, and on an income-adjusted basis, they're infinitely higher than what we pay. So the solution there is greater competition, better technology, and various programs such as the ones Facebook and Google are doing. In our case, we've been funding fiber cables and other things to connect these countries to get them linked up together. I'm very proud of that.
Great. So there's a growing interest both in government, in the private sector, and philanthropy in the identification of 21st century moonshots. So in the same way that President Kennedy said, let's put a man on the moon, we decided to sequence the human genome. President Obama unveiled support for the BRAIN initiative, which is aimed at dramatically increasing understanding of how the brain processes and encodes information. Elon Musk has said, I want to die on Mars, but not on impact. What do you think are some of the of these grand challenges or 21st century moonshots that you think deserve more attention?
And I should tell you all that Tom wrote a moonshot document that I used as my reference, so you might want to add a little bit to this as well. When I think about it, I start with looking at what's happening in biology. And the reality is that in all of our lifetimes, synthetic biology does appear to be able to allow us to regrow at least small parts of our body, and the change of that, is the way medicine and health is going to be amazing.
So we could eliminate the waiting list for an organ donation.
Yeah. So most people would like to regrow their entire body when they're older, and that's not the current plan. Although maybe in the future, but at the moment, people, especially in transplant and other kinds of situations where there's acute illness, there's hope that your own organ can be grown. And there's a lot of people who think that that's achievable, and again, reasonably soon in our terms. If you take a look at progress in cancer, the work that's going on in the genetics revolution, and the ability to statistically pinpoint the causes of the cancer and cancer-related diseases has accelerated because of supercomputers. Google, I guess I'd say Google/Alphabet has been working with the Broad Institute, which is one of the centers to do this, to build a platform for genomics to accelerate the manipulation of full genomes. And everybody here knows that the cost of having your genome sequenced has been falling faster than Moore's Law. So there's every reason to think that in the future, what will happen is you go to the doctor, there'll be some sort of sequencer, they'll take some biologic, get it be sequenced, and they'll say, oops, there we go, and they'll do some database comparison. What gets interesting is when you start getting a large enough database of that information anonymized, you can begin to predict drug interactions at the genetic level, right, which you've never been able to do, and it's the dawn of real personalized medicine. You mentioned the BRAIN initiative. There are debates as to whether the correct approach is to look at the way the brain works or look at digital versions of how thinking and reasoning might work. We find that very interesting. We already talked about machine learning and AI. The transformation for cities is turning out to be very interesting. There's a lot of evidence that cities are where most of the innovation, most of the growth will occur. I'm going to China in a week or so. The Chinese leadership has announced that they still need 6 cities for 300 million people to move from rural to city. Now, by the way, if you do a little bit of math, that's cities of 50 million people, right? And they have to be built new because the current cities with 50 million people are full, right? So imagine what that means from infrastructure planning and so forth. And I think that they're serious about it. And there are many, many things that we can do with respect to making cities much safer, much more efficient, much better from a transportation perspective. To make city life both more prosperous, more desirable, and frankly, we might as well do it because it's going to happen anyway. So those are some examples.
And on the flip side, what do you think are some of the risks that we should be worried about? So obviously, there's a lot of people who've been concerned about the notion of an intelligence explosion, where artificial intelligence becomes...
So we're clear. I'm in favor of more intelligence.
So what do you think are the risks that are legitimate for people to worry about? So how worried should we be about, like, an electronic Pearl Harbor, which is something that people have talked about for
on the first part of your question, I think we've all grown up with the best Hollywood can ever make, and they always have bad outcomes involving this scenario.
Right.
I think that's the unlikely scenario. This is science fiction. We're working very, very hard to make humans smarter. And Google has already made you smarter in that everything I've said, you can now check and see if I'm correct or not. And you couldn't do that 20 years ago on this location, or 10 years ago, or maybe you get the idea. You'd have to go to the library. So now you can just decide if you agree with me or not, and it holds me to a higher standard and you as well. We've adapted to that. We're smarter as a result. Now take that fast forward. That makes sense to me. I do worry about the militarization of cyberspace. And there are a series of articles about the number of countries that now have what I would call offensive cyber war capabilities. When I started looking at this, it was commonly assumed that it was America, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and the Israelis. But now that was just the common assumption, nobody really knew. And the common assumption now is a much larger set. And so we're going to have to go through some sort of a broad conversation about the appropriate and inappropriate use of those at a state level. We've already seen from China a large number of attacks on American firms, including Google, obviously, which are pretty clear they're state-sponsored. Now, they're done perhaps by individuals that are not in the military, but when you trace it down, it appears to be a deliberate strategy by people associated with the government or the government itself to steal intellectual property from America to advance their own industries and their own plans. That just doesn't seem right to me.
So I also wanted to talk about governance, and particularly how does the government, the private sector, and civil society work together to solve problems. What are some examples of public-private partnerships that Google has been involved in that you think worked well? And
well,
that
we've
you're particularly
sent
proud of?
a lot of our employees to the government, right? And most of the people who seem to be really doing well in the government in the tech sector seem to be ex-Google employees. So that's our contribution. And these are people with a great sense of civic service and so forth. We obviously encourage that. My observation of the government is that I remember this from years ago, and I think it's still true, the government is designed precisely to move slowly, and our industry is designed to precisely move quickly, right? And the incentives are misaligned. And so the more of the kind of people that we can find here in the Valley and San Francisco and so forth, who are willing to take at a significant personal cost to go in and try to influence it, the better. You and I have spoken about, just imagine putting some tech folks, tech-minded folks, into each of the major cabinet operations, and thinking about doing things differently, reaching their consumers, measuring things differently, delivering services differently. The government has just now, one of the things that you did when you were in the Clinton administration is you worked to get everyone to have an email address, right? And this was considered very impressive at the time, Tom. And that was because they had some weird standard email, and now, of course, they have proper email. So that was progress. So under the Obama administration, we now have, everyone has a website and they have to say what they're doing, right? So again, there's some lag there, and that lag is a productivity lag.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the architects of the effort to bring more techies in the government is here in the audience, Jen Palka, who I think deserves a round of applause.
Thank you, Jen.
So you talked about sort of what collaboration with the U.S. government, but what about in other governments or in developing countries as well?
A lot of my time is spent visiting with the leadership of these other countries, and they vary quite widely. And I'll make some broad generalities, and obviously there are always exceptions. When you go to China, you have a sense that these are people in a very big hurry, and it's very entrepreneurial. Mm-hmm. They're building a modern society, maybe different from the way we like it, faster than has ever been done before. And you see that when you talk to the regulators and so forth. They have this unfortunate problem that they want to control information, which ultimately doesn't work. That's part of the principles of the internet. We fight them on that. If you think about Europe, full of incredibly smart people, incredibly educated people, continues to resist the pace of change that American firms, and the politics are, I'm not talking about the regulation, but the politics are roughly anti-American. And if you look, they invented a term called GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, to identify the four, right?
The four horsemen of the apocalypse.
That's right. Uh-huh. Another term they invented, but we're not going to talk about that. But in fact, there are more firms, and there are initiatives in Europe, for example, to try to prevent platforms from spreading all throughout Europe, which I think is completely misinformed. And I say this to them. They have other problems. A typical way that if you want to torment a European leader is you say, how long does it take to start up a company in your country? Mm-hmm. Right. And they often don't know. And then they say that they'd like to have the Silicon Valley success. And I said, look, just copy our rules. Right. There's no secret as to how Silicon Valley has done this. And frankly, as much as I'd like to tell you that it's the weather, it's not the weather. Okay.
That helps.
It's the educational system. Mm-hmm. It's the limited liability. Mm-hmm. It's the ability to take risks. It's the decriminalization of failure. Just all those kinds of things. And there are reasons why this model continues to excel here, and they need to respond to that. Mm-hmm. The rest of the world is hoping to skip in the industrial age up to connectivity. And their hope, I'll give you an example. We were mentioning earlier about M-Pesa in Kenya. We were in Kenya sort of walking it. And you get a sense that there are plenty of smart people with smartphones. You really can build this to make happen. So I think they'll get there.
Mm-hmm. One question we got from the audience was, what are you going to do once you run out of the 26 letters in the alphabet?
We're going to move to...
A prime.
We're probably going to use transcendental numbers. 0, 1, E, pi, rho. That's the most likely. But Google always reserves the rights to surprise you at the end.
Okay. So when you least expect it, expect it.
That's right.
And are there some things that you would see as being off the table, e.g. online gambling?
We've looked at a fair number of things like that, and we've tried to stay on sort of a proper side of a lot of those questions. Mm-hmm. I would doubt that Google Alphabet would get involved in military things. I think historically we've stayed away from them. I would doubt we would say we would get close to things like gambling and those sorts of activities. Without passing comment on them, we're just busy with sort of the core things that I'm talking about.
Right. Another discussion is largely focused on the positive potential that technology can have on human lives, from education to health to transport. But what aspect of our lives should technology be pushed back so that we can retain our human capabilities?
Well, I'm working on my own project in this area, which is I'm attempting to turn off my mobile phones during dinner. Now, I've since learned that dinner is 90 minutes long, and I can just about do it, especially if I take a peek when the dessert is happening.
So you don't start twitching?
Yeah, that sort of. And a number of us went to North Korea, and which is the last place where there is, in fact, no connectivity. And the joke was that our hands were twitching for hours until eventually we sort of forgot. And the moment we returned to Beijing, that testament of capitalism and free speech, we immediately turned our devices on. So there's something about these tools, and I think it's important that they serve in our interest and that we don't serve in their interest.
Right.
I use the dinner one as an example, but I think that you all get the metaphor pretty well. I worry about the implications for jobs as the whole purpose of this conference. And in particular, what I worry about is that there are people who are employed, who are not motivated, not happy, don't want to come to work, not particularly interested in anything. They're just sort of like blah. They're the ones that are going to be at risk here, right? There are plenty of equivalent people who are quick starters, ready for something new. They're going to do great. So you've got to think about that person who is displaced. Again, this is not a new subject, but we need to have that conversation.
I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about philanthropy and ask you to reflect a little bit about your own philanthropy, but what you think might be done to inspire, to get more of our successful entrepreneurs involved earlier in their career as opposed to waiting until they retire.
One of the observations is that this generation, my generation of people, sort of the baby boomers, as a group we retire, it'll be the largest amount of philanthropic money ever raised by many factors. And so there's a great danger that money, because these people eventually do die and they really will give the money away before they die. There's a great danger that a lot of that money is going to be wasted. And the tech industry is much more specific and much more measurable in the way we behave, and that's true in philanthropy as well. So I think the first observation is there is an opportunity for guidance around what is most important. And without commenting on the other things, anything involving education, entrepreneurship, getting this next generation capable of creating great new ideas, great businesses, great wealth, that's a wonderful way of transmitting it over. There's a long history of philanthropy in the support of science and in the arts. And I'm sure that the arts will get taken care of. There are plenty of patrons of that. But you and I and a number of people have been working on how do we get more money into basic research.
Right.
I should warn everybody that much of what you're using today comes from basic research that was done 20 or 30 years ago by institutions that no longer have that funding, right? Bell Labs, Xerox PARC, and so forth. And I'll give another interesting statistic in the healthcare. We were studying this at the White House. The peak of NIH funding was around 2008 or so, and then there was a real cut in NIH funding, National Institutes of Health, by about 30% in real dollars, which is an extraordinary reduction. People like the world I care about was largely flat. So what did that do? Well, the average time for getting a grant, if you're a researcher in that field, went up by a decade, right? The first grant. So there, in fact, is understood that there's a gap between the sort of graduate student with great potential postdoc and becoming a proper researcher of a decade, right? That's a hole that can be filled and needs to be filled by philanthropy.
Any questions that I didn't ask that you'd like to answer?
That's a Kissinger question. Yeah. I think my message to you all is that I am, having worked on this now for the last few years in my new job, I'm actually of the opinion that the rate is about to accelerate pretty quickly. That you're here in the Bay Area, and every dinner, every lunch, there's a new profound idea. And a lot of this is because the cost of entry is so much lower. The platforms, whether they're scientific or genetic or software or hardware design platforms, are now so much cheaper, that the barrier to entry is so much cheaper, that the level of innovation that we've seen now is simply a precursor to a far greater expansion of that, which I view as almost completely overwhelmingly wonderful.
So we're improving the improvement process.
I believe that this will happen fast enough that I hope you remember that I told you that this is not the end of something, but rather the beginning of something much, much more powerful.
Well, on that optimistic note, please join me in thanking Eric Schmidt.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Tom.